Christmas is coming, and I will be alone this year. So please leave a Christmas greeting that will warm my heart in the comments. Okay, let's go. The Shadow of Krampus. Christmas was my favorite time of the year. Our family had always celebrated it in the little cabin deep in the Black Forest, far from the bustle of the city. The tradition had started with my Großvater, who believed that a true Christmas was spent surrounded by nature, where the silence made you feel closer to God. This year was no different. My wife Greta and I packed up the car and drove to the cabin with our 2 children, Klaus and Lotte. Klaus was 9, sharp and full of questions, while Lotte, barely 6, had a boundless imagination that sometimes unnerved me with its odd stories. The cabin itself had aged over the years, but it still stood strong. Its wooden beams groaned in the cold, and the small hearth was just big enough to keep the chill at bay. By the time we arrived, thick snow blanketed the woods. Greta began unpacking while I fetched firewood from the shed, the sound of Klaus and Lotte's laughter echoing through the trees as they played outside. It was perfect, until the first strange thing happened. As night fell, the air grew sharper, colder than it should have been, even for December. Greta had just finished decorating the modest Christmas tree when Klaus came inside, dragging his boots across the wooden floor. "Papa," he said, his brows knitted together, "there's something wrong with the snow." "What do you mean, wrong?" He hesitated, then looked back toward the door. "It's red." I frowned and stepped outside. Sure enough, in the patch of snow near the edge of the forest, streaks of crimson marred the otherwise pure white landscape. It wasn't bright like fresh blood, but faded, like it had been there for days. A strange metallic scent hung in the air, faint but unmistakable. "Probably an animal," I said, trying to sound calm, though a knot had already formed in my stomach. "Let's go inside." That night, we put the children to bed early. Greta and I stayed up by the fire, sipping mulled wine and listening to the wind howl against the shutters. Every now and then I thought I heard something, a faint scraping sound like claws against wood. But every time I checked, there was nothing there. The next morning the air was heavy with tension. Klaus and Lotte were unusually quiet as we ate breakfast. Greta tried to lighten the mood by suggesting we bake cookies, but Lotte shook her head and whispered, "He's watching." I froze. "Who's watching, Lotte?" She pointed to the window. "The man with the horns." Greta and I exchanged a look. I stepped over to the window and peered outside. The snow-covered trees stretched endlessly into the distance, their branches swaying in the bitter wind. There was no one there. "You must have dreamed it," I said gently. But Lotte only shook her head, her wide eyes brimming with certainty. That evening, things escalated. It began with a loud crash in the kitchen. Greta and I ran to investigate, finding a glass shattered on the floor. No one had touched it. A few minutes later, the front door rattled violently, as if someone were trying to break in. When I opened it, the night was eerily silent. Greta was beginning to panic. "Maybe it's a bear," she said, though her voice trembled. "Bears don't rattle doors," I muttered, locking it securely. The children clung to Greta as we gathered in the living room. I stoked the fire, trying to push away the growing sense of dread. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin. Lotte whimpered and buried her face in Greta's shoulder. Klaus tried to be brave but couldn't hide his fear. I grabbed the rifle my Großvater had left behind, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was deathly quiet. Then came the sound of claws dragging across the roof. The next morning, we found hoofprints in the snow, impossibly large and ending abruptly, as if whatever made them had leapt into the air. Klaus noticed something else. The red snow from the previous day was gone, replaced by fresh, untouched white. Greta wanted to leave, but the snowstorm had worsened overnight. The narrow road leading back to the city was impassable. We were trapped. By nightfall, the atmosphere in the cabin was suffocating. I tried to keep the children distracted with stories by the fire, but Lotta kept glancing at the window, her face pale. "He's here," she whispered. A loud knock echoed through the cabin. It wasn't the wind this time. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and it came from the front door. "Stay here," I said, gripping the rifle tightly. Greta started to protest, but I gave her a look that silenced her. When I opened the door, there was no one there, only a bundle of twigs tied together with a black ribbon. Things spiraled out of control after that. The twigs appeared again, scattered across the children's beds. Greta screamed when she found claw marks gouged into the kitchen table. The fire in the hearth extinguished itself, plunging us into darkness. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from inside the house. I told Greta to take the children and lock themselves in the bedroom while I searched the cabin. My heart pounded as I moved from room to room, the rifle trembling in my hands. The growling seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. When I reached the attic, the door creaked open on its own. The air inside was frigid, and the stench of sulfur was overwhelming. In the faint moonlight streaming through the window, I saw it. A hulking figure with twisted horns and glowing red eyes. Krampus! I stumbled back, nearly dropping the rifle. The creature let out a guttural laugh that shook the walls. "You've been judged!" it growled, its voice deep and echoing. "Leave my family alone!" I shouted, though my voice cracked with terror. It lunged toward me, its claws swiping inches from my face. I fired the rifle, but the bullet passed through it as if it were made of smoke. Greta's scream from downstairs jolted me into action. I sprinted back to the living room to find her clutching the children, her face pale. The furniture was levitating, spinning wildly before crashing to the ground. "Papa!" Klaus cried. I grabbed the black ribbon from the bundle of twigs, my mind racing. In old stories, ribbons and charms were said to bind spirits. I threw it into the fire. The room shook violently as Krampus let out an ear-piercing roar. The flames turned blue, and the air grew warmer. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The cabin fell silent. We left the next morning, abandoning the cabin and everything inside. Greta and I never spoke of what happened, though Lotta would occasionally whisper about the man with the horns. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced. All I know is that Krampus is real, and he doesn't just punish children. The haunting bells of Zermatt. It was supposed to be the Christmas vacation of a lifetime. My wife, Emily, and I had decided to splurge on a trip to the Swiss Alps, renting a charming chalet in the picturesque village of Zermatt. The snow-draped peaks, twinkling Christmas lights, and warm fireplaces seemed like the perfect backdrop for a holiday escape. Joining us were our close friends, Mark and Hannah, along with their teenage son, Ethan. The village was everything we'd hoped for, straight out of a Christmas card. The cobblestone streets wound past quaint wooden houses, and the air was filled with the scent of roasting chestnuts and pine. Villagers greeted us warmly, though a few seemed distracted, their eyes darting toward the looming forest that bordered the town. On our first evening, we gathered in the chalet's cozy living room, laughing over mugs of mulled wine. A soft snowfall blanketed the landscape, and everything felt perfect. That was until the bells started. It began as a faint sound, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, tilting her head. We all fell silent, straining our ears. The sound was rhythmic, soft jingling, like sleigh bells carried on the wind. "It's probably just someone walking through town," Mark said, brushing it off. But the sound didn't come from the streets. It was coming from the woods. We shrugged it off and went back to our conversation, but the jingling stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next morning, as we strolled through the village, Ethan overheard a group of villagers talking in hushed tones. They were speaking German, but the words Krampusnacht and bells were unmistakable. "Krampusnacht," Ethan repeated when he rejoined us. "Isn't that like Krampus night, the thing about the Christmas demon?" Emily chuckled nervously. "That's just folklore, like Santa Claus's evil twin or something." But the tension in the villagers' voices suggested otherwise. We asked the innkeeper about it that evening, over a round of schnapps. His smile faltered and he leaned in closer. "Tonight is the longest night of the year," he said in heavily accented English. "On this night the veil is thin. The Krampus comes to punish the wicked." Mark laughed, but it was forced. "Come on, you don't really believe that, do you?" The innkeeper didn't answer. He just looked out the window where the forest loomed dark and silent against the snow. That night, the bells returned. We were sitting around the table, playing cards, when the jingling started again. This time, it was louder, closer. Emily froze, her hand halfway to her glass of wine. "It's back," she whispered. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. Mark got up and went to the window, peering into the darkness. "I don't see anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then came the knock. It was sharp, deliberate, and impossibly loud, as if someone, or something, was pounding on the chalet door with the strength of a battering ram. We all jumped to our feet, staring at the door. "Who would be out in this weather?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Mark grabbed a fire poker from the hearth. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the door. "No!" Hannah hissed. "Don't open it!" Mark hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. The knock came again, even louder this time. The sound echoed through the chalet, rattling the windows. Finally, Mark flung the door open. There was nothing there. Just the swirling snow and the distant trees. "See?" he said, turning back to us with a shaky grin. "Probably just the wind." But as he closed the door, the jingling bells started up again, louder than ever. We barely slept that night. Every creak of the chalet, every gust of wind felt like a threat. By morning we were all exhausted, our nerves frayed. The villagers too seemed on edge. As we walked through the square, we noticed people nailing sprigs of holly above their doors and scattering salt along the thresholds. "What's with all the holly?" Ethan asked the shopkeeper. "It wards off the Krampus," she said simply, then quickly turned back to her work. That evening, the tension reached its breaking point. We were sitting in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie when the power went out. The chalet was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the howling wind. "Great," Mark muttered, fumbling for his phone. Then we heard it, heavy footsteps on the roof. My blood turned to ice. The sound was slow and deliberate, like something enormous pacing above us. "Reindeer?" Hannah whispered, clutching Ethan, but we all knew better. The footsteps moved toward the chimney, and then there was a guttural growl that echoed down into the room. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing Emily's hand. But before we could move, the front door slammed open, as if hit by an invisible force. Snow and wind whipped into the room, extinguishing the fire. Standing in the doorway was a massive figure. It was covered in dark fur with horns that scraped the top of the frame. Its eyes glowed red, and its mouth curled into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. "Run!" Mark shouted. We bolted out the back door, stumbling through the snow toward the village. Behind us, the jingling bells grew deafening, accompanied by guttural snarls. The villagers were already gathered in the square, holding torches and chanting in unison. "It's here!" I shouted, pointing toward the dark shape moving through the snow. The villagers didn't hesitate. They raised their torches and advanced, their chants growing louder. The Krampus paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. Then, with an ear-splitting roar, it turned and retreated into the forest, the bells fading into the distance. Herr Müller, the village elder, approached us. "You were lucky," he said gravely, "but the Krampus will not leave so easily. You must go before it returns." We didn't argue. By dawn, we were packed and driving out of Zermatt, leaving the cursed village behind. Even now, back home in the States, I sometimes hear the faint jingle of bells on quiet nights. And every time I wonder if the Krampus will find us again. Krampus comes for the wicked. Christmas had always been a cherished time for my family, but this year felt different. After years of crowded city living, we decided to spend the holidays in the countryside. My wife, Annika, found a quaint but remote cottage in the Bavarian Alps, far from the noise and bustle of Munich. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. The cottage, with its steep roof and weathered wooden shutters, looked like it had been plucked from an old German fairy tale. Snow blanketed the surrounding forest, and the mountains loomed majestically in the distance. We arrived just as dusk was settling in, bringing with us our 7-year-old son, Tobias, and my 16-year-old niece, Carla, who had come to stay with us for the holidays. They were excited, talking about decorating the tree and building a snowman, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my chest the moment we set foot on the property. The first night passed uneventfully. We lit a fire, played card games, and drank hot cocoa. The isolation was refreshing, though a sense of quiet that bordered on oppressive seemed to seep into the air. It was the second night when things began to feel off. While unpacking some of the Christmas decorations, Tobias found an old wooden carving tucked away in a corner of the living room. It was strange, depicting a horned figure with a grotesque, sneering face. "Papa, who is this?" Tobias asked, holding it up. I froze, recognizing the figure instantly. "That's Krampus," I said hesitantly. "He's a character from old stories. He punishes naughty children during Christmas." Tobias frowned and handed the carving to Carla, who chuckled nervously. "Well, that's creepy. Why would anyone keep this around?" I took the figure and placed it back where Tobias had found it, hoping to put it out of sight and mind. That night, as we were settling down to watch a Christmas movie, there was a sudden crash in the kitchen. Annika and I jumped up, rushing to see what had happened. The kitchen light flickered as we entered, revealing shards of glass scattered across the floor. The window above the sink was cracked, as though something had struck it from outside. "Did an animal get in?" Annika asked, her voice trembling. I checked the window but found no signs of entry. The forest beyond was still, cloaked in a thick layer of snow, The uneasiness lingered into the next day. Tobias seemed quieter than usual, and Carla kept glancing at the woods as though she expected something to emerge from between the trees. That evening, I woke abruptly in the middle of the night to the sound of heavy footsteps. They weren't in the house. They were on the roof. "Did you hear that?" Annika whispered, clutching my arm. I nodded, heart pounding. The steps were slow and deliberate, echoing through the silence of the cottage. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The following morning, we found deep hoof prints in the snow outside the front door. They were far too large to belong to any deer, and the distance between them was unnatural, as though whatever had made them was walking on two legs. "I don't like this mark," Annika said, her voice low. "Something's wrong here." "I know," I replied, glancing at Tobias and Carla, who were watching us with wide, fearful eyes. Things escalated that night. We were sitting around the fireplace, trying to keep the mood light with Christmas songs, when the lights flickered and went out completely. The only illumination came from the fire, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Then came the knocking. It was loud and insistent, coming from the front door. Annika gasped, and Tobias clung to her tightly. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight and stepping toward the door. When I opened it, there was no one there, only a burlap sack sitting on the porch. Inside the sack was a bundle of switches, tied together with a red ribbon. I slammed the door shut, my pulse racing. Annika looked at me, her face pale. "What was it?" "Nothing," I lied, though I knew she could see the fear in my eyes. That night, Tobias woke us up screaming, "Papa, there's someone in my room!" I bolted out of bed and rushed to his room, finding him huddled under the blanket. "What happened?" "He was standing there," Tobias sobbed, pointing to the corner of the room. "The man with horns." Annika joined us, holding Tobias tightly. I checked the room, but it was empty. Still, the air was icy cold, and the faint scent of sulfur lingered. When we returned to the living room, we found Carla sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She didn't turn to look at us as we entered. "Carla?" Annika asked, her voice shaking. "He's here," Carla said flatly. "Who?" "Krampus!" The next few hours were a blur of chaos. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the windows rattled violently. The fire in the hearth went out, plunging the room into darkness. A low, guttural growl echoed through the cottage, sending chills down my spine. Then we saw him. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen, his massive frame silhouetted against the darkness. His horns scraped the ceiling, and his glowing red eyes bored into us. In one clawed hand, he held a chain that rattled ominously as he stepped closer. "Mark, do something!" Annika screamed. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and swung it at the figure, but it passed through him like smoke. Krampus let out a deep, menacing laugh that shook the walls. "You've been judged," he growled, his voice reverberating through the room. Desperate, I remembered the stories my grossmutter used to tell me about Krampus. He could only be driven away by an act of true repentance. "Carla," I said urgently, "light the candle on the Advent wreath. Now!" She scrambled to obey, her hands trembling as she struck a match and lit the first candle. The faint light seemed to drive Krampus back slightly, though his growl deepened. I knelt down, holding Tobias close. "We have to apologize," I said, "for everything, for every lie, every selfish act. Now!" Annika began to sob, whispering apologies for every wrong she could think of. Carla joined in, her voice shaky but sincere. Even Tobias, through his tears, began to confess to small childhood misdeeds. The room grew warmer, and Krampus let out an enraged roar. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. The next morning, the cottage was eerily quiet. The hoof prints in the snow had disappeared, and the air felt lighter. We left that day, abandoning our plans to spend Christmas in the countryside. To this day, we never speak of what happened in that cottage. But every year, when we light the Advent wreath, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine, remembering the night Krampus came for us. The night of the Krampen. Christmas in the Alps sounded like a dream come true. My brother Jake and I decided to rent a chalet in a picturesque village called Tiefenberg, nestled deep in the mountains. We brought our families along, my wife, Laura, and our 10-year-old son, Daniel, along with Jake's wife, Megan, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. We'd seen pictures of the village before arriving: cobblestone streets, quaint houses with snow-covered roofs, and a massive Christmas tree in the town square. It was like stepping into a postcard. The villagers were friendly but reserved, as if they carried some unspoken weight. There was an undercurrent of tension beneath their polite smiles. They told us about the Krampenlauf, the traditional parade of men dressed as Krampus, a horned Christmas demon who punished naughty children. At first, we thought it was just a fun, eccentric custom, but we soon learned the truth. The Krampen weren't just a myth. On Christmas Eve, we all gathered in the chalet's cozy living room, sipping hot cocoa by the fire. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, and snowflakes swirled like tiny ghosts in the dim light. The kids were buzzing with excitement about the next morning's presents, and we felt at peace, far removed from the stresses of our lives back home in Chicago. Then came the sound. A low, guttural growl echoed through the village, carried by the wind. It was faint at first, almost like a trick of the imagination, but it grew louder. "What was that?" Megan asked, her voice shaky. "Probably just a dog," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. Daniel and Sophie froze, their eyes wide. "It didn't sound like a dog," Daniel whispered. Laura and I exchanged a nervous glance. "Let's not scare ourselves," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's probably nothing." But deep down, I felt an unease that I couldn't shake. Later that night, after the kids were tucked into bed, Jake and I stepped outside to get some fresh air. The snow crunched beneath our boots, and our breath billowed in the cold air. The village was eerily quiet, the only light coming from the occasional flickering lantern. "Do you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice low. I listened. Faint bells jingled in the distance, accompanied by heavy dragging footsteps. We turned toward the sound and saw a figure standing at the edge of the village, partially obscured by shadow. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and its silhouette was grotesque, with long twisted horns and a hunched back. "What the hell?" I muttered. The figure stepped closer, and the lantern light revealed its face. It was monstrous, with glowing red eyes, a long blackened tongue that hung from its mouth, and a body covered in matted fur. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing my arm. We sprinted back to the chalet, slamming the door behind us. Inside, we woke the others and told them what we'd seen. "A costume," Laura suggested, though her voice trembled. "It wasn't a costume," I said firmly. Whatever it wasn't human. As the night wore on, the strange noises continued. The growls and jingling bells seemed to circle the chalet, accompanied by faint scratching at the windows. The kids were terrified, clinging to their mothers as Jake and I tried to appear calm. Around midnight, a loud, echoing bang reverberated through the village. We peeked out the window and saw lights flickering on in the other houses. The villagers were gathering in the square, some armed with torches, others with farming tools. "Stay here," I told Laura. "Jake and I will check it out." "Be careful," she said, her face pale. We joined the villagers in the square, where Herr Klein, the village elder, was addressing the crowd. He spoke in rapid Swiss German, but another villager translated for us. "The Krampen have come," the man said grimly. "This is not the parade. This is real." Jake and I exchanged a stunned glance. "What do you mean, real?" Jake asked. "The Krampen are spirits of the mountain," Herr Klein explained through the translator. "They come to punish the wicked. Normally, they do not bother the village, but something has drawn them here tonight." The villagers murmured among themselves, fear etched into their faces. "What do we do?" I asked. "We drive them out," Herr Klein said, holding up a torch. "It is the only way." The villagers formed a procession, marching toward the outskirts of the village where the Krampen was said to dwell. Jake and I joined them, more out of curiosity than bravery. The bells grew louder as we approached the edge of the forest, and the air grew colder, as if the very life had been sucked out of it. Then we saw them. Dozens of Krampen emerged from the shadows, their horns gleaming in the torchlight. They moved with an unnatural gait, their clawed hands dragging heavy chains behind them. The sight was so horrifying that I felt my knees go weak. The villagers didn't falter. They shouted chants in unison, brandishing their torches and tools. The Krampen hesitated, their red eyes flickering with something that almost resembled fear. Jake and I grabbed torches and joined the chants, our voices blending with the villagers. Slowly, the Krampen began to retreat, their growls echoing through the trees as they disappeared into the darkness. By dawn, the village was quiet again, though an unease lingered in the air. Herr Klein approached us as we returned to the square. "The Krampen will not return," he said, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Not for a long time, at least. We thanked him and the villagers for their bravery, but the experience had shaken us to our core. That morning, we packed our bags and left Tiefenberg, vowing never to return. Even now, back in the safety of our home, I sometimes hear the faint jingle of bells in the distance and wonder if the Krampen will ever find their way to us again. Krampusnacht Terror. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year, so when my wife, Rachel, suggested we spend the holidays abroad in Germany, I was thrilled. The idea of visiting the Christmas markets, seeing the Alps, and indulging in traditional German holiday foods seemed like a dream come true. We brought our 2 kids along, 10-year-old Ethan, who was obsessed with snowball fights, and our 13-year-old daughter Grace, who loved history and had been excited to explore German castles. Our Airbnb was a cozy half-timbered house in a small village nestled in the Bavarian countryside. It felt like stepping back in time, with cobblestone streets, gaslit lamps, and the snow-covered spires of a centuries-old church. We arrived 2 days before Christmas and were warmly greeted by our host, Herr Meyer, an elderly man with a thick accent and a face like crumpled parchment. He handed us the keys and gave us a quick tour of the house, but as he was leaving, he paused at the door and fixed me with a serious look. "Do not ignore the traditions here," he said. "Be good, and whatever you do, stay inside on Krampusnacht." I chuckled nervously, thinking he was trying to add some local folklore flavor to our visit. "Krampusnacht? Isn't that the night of the 5th? He shook his head. "Here, it comes with Christmas. Some places, Krampus follows St. Nicholas. With that cryptic warning, he left. The house was beautiful inside, filled with rustic wooden furniture and the smell of pine from a freshly cut Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. We spent the first evening decorating it with ornaments we'd picked up at the market. Grace hung a delicate glass angel, and Ethan proudly placed a glittering star at the top of the tree. Everything seemed perfect until later that night. We were playing a board game in the living room when we heard a soft scratching noise, like claws scraping against wood. I dismissed it as a branch brushing against the window, but it persisted, growing louder and more deliberate. "Dad, what's that?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with unease. I got up to check, peeking out through the curtains. The snow was falling steadily, blanketing the village in a peaceful hush. There was nothing outside. "It's just the wind," I said, though I wasn't convinced myself. The next day was Christmas Eve, and the kids wanted to explore the village. We strolled through the market stalls, admiring the handmade ornaments and sampling stolen. Ethan begged for roasted chestnuts, while Grace insisted we buy a carved nutcracker for her collection. An older woman selling wreaths stopped us as we walked by. "You're not from here," she said in heavily accented English. "No, we're visiting from New York," Rachel said with a friendly smile. The woman didn't return the smile. "Do you know the stories of Krampus?" "We've heard of him," I said, shrugging. "He's like the anti-Santa, right? Punishes bad kids?" Her eyes darkened. "He does more than punish. Be careful tonight. Krampusnacht is not just a story." Before we could respond, she turned back to her stall, muttering something under her breath. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, the air in the house felt heavy. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The kids were unusually quiet, and even Rachel seemed on edge. As we were finishing dessert, a loud thump came from the roof. Ethan's fork clattered to the table. "Santa?" he asked hopefully. Rachel and I exchanged uneasy glances. "It's probably just snow sliding off the roof," I said, trying to sound calm. But then came the growling. It was low and guttural, resonating through the walls. The sound was followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps above us. "Mark," Rachel whispered, clutching my arm. I grabbed the fireplace poker and headed for the front door, determined to put an end to this nonsense. When I stepped outside, the icy wind cut through me and the snow glistened under the moonlight. The roof was empty, but there, in the fresh snow leading away from the house, were hoof prints. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Rachel was pacing, her phone in hand. "We should call someone," she said. "Who?" I snapped, more out of fear than anger. "It's probably just some local kids messing with us." "Dad," Grace said, her voice shaking. "There's something wrong with the tree." I turned to look. The ornaments were swinging wildly, though there was no draft in the room. And then, before our eyes, the angel at the top of the tree slowly rotated, its delicate face cracking into a grotesque, leering grin. Rachel screamed, and Ethan burst into tears. The growling returned, this time louder and closer, coming from the hallway. "Upstairs!" I shouted, herding my family toward the staircase. We scrambled into the master bedroom, locking the door behind us. The noises continued, echoing through the house, pounding footsteps, doors slamming, and the unmistakable jingle of chains dragging across the floor. Rachel clutched Ethan, who was sobbing uncontrollably. Grace sat against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest, staring blankly at the door. Then the doorknob began to turn. I gripped the fireplace poker tightly, my heart hammering in my chest. The door shook violently and a deep voice growled, "Open the door, or I'll come through." The accent was thick, the voice inhuman. "Leave us alone!" I shouted. The growling turned into a chilling laugh. Then, with a deafening crash, the door splintered open. Standing there was Krampus, just as I'd seen in the old illustrations, tall and hulking, with curling horns, glowing red eyes, and a long tongue that flicked out between his jagged teeth. His claws dripped with something dark, and the chains around his waist rattled as he stepped into the room. "You've been judged!" he snarled. Rachel screamed as Krampus lunged for Ethan, his claws outstretched. I swung the poker with all my strength, but it passed through him like smoke. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Ethan and shoving him toward the door. We bolted down the stairs and out into the snow, not stopping until we reached the church at the edge of the village. We banged on the heavy wooden doors until the priest let us in. Breathless, I explained what had happened. The priest's face grew grim, and he nodded knowingly. "You ignored the warnings," he said. "Krampus comes for those who forget the spirit of Christmas." He lit a candle and began to pray, his voice steady and calm. The air in the church grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. When we returned to the house the next morning, it was quiet, as though nothing had happened. But the hoof prints in the snow remained, circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. We left that day, vowing never to return to Germany at Christmas. The Shadow in the Alps. Christmas in the Alps had been my wife's idea. Ever since Rachel read about the charming chalets, snow-capped peaks, and enchanting holiday traditions, she insisted we take a break from our usual celebrations in Florida. I was hesitant at first. Swapping sunny beaches for freezing snow wasn't my idea of fun. But our kids, Oliver and Hannah, were thrilled at the prospect of skiing and seeing a real white Christmas. We rented a small chalet in a remote village called Grimsberg. It looked like something out of a postcard, perched on a hill with a breathtaking view of the mountains. The locals were friendly, though their heavy accents made understanding them a challenge. Everywhere we went, there was talk of Knecht Ruprecht, a figure I didn't recognize, but was apparently part of their holiday folklore. "Think of him as Santa's darker helper," said our host, Herr Dürer, when I asked about it. "He comes to punish the naughty. Some say he even takes them away to the mountains." It sounded like the kind of thing people told kids to scare them into behaving, but there was something about the way Herr Dürer said it, like he truly believed it, that sent a shiver down my spine. The first few days were magical. The kids learned to ski on the beginner slopes, we drank hot chocolate by the fire, and Rachel spent hours admiring the handmade ornaments in the local shops. On Christmas Eve, the village held a small festival with carolers, a bonfire, and stalls selling mulled wine and roasted chestnuts. That night, after we put the kids to bed, Rachel and I sat by the fire talking about how perfect the trip had been. Then we heard it. A soft, rhythmic thumping sound coming from the roof. Rachel tilted her head, listening. "Is that footsteps?" I laughed nervously. "Probably just snow sliding off. These roofs are steep." But the sound continued, moving across the ceiling, slow and deliberate. Then came a sharp clatter, like something heavy had fallen. Rachel's eyes widened. "Should we check?" Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside, the cold biting into me as I scanned the roof. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed, pristine under the moonlight. I was about to go back inside when I noticed something strange near the edge of the house. A single set of footprints, larger than any I'd ever seen, leading away from the house and disappearing into the woods. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The next day, Christmas morning, the kids were excited to open their gifts. I kept quiet about the footprints, not wanting to ruin the holiday. But as Oliver tore into his presents, he paused, frowning. "What's wrong, buddy?" I asked. He held up a small wooden figurine, crudely carved, with a gnarled face and a sack slung over its shoulder. "I didn't ask for this," he said. Rachel and I exchanged puzzled glances. "Maybe it was meant to go with your sister's dollhouse," Rachel said, though I could tell she wasn't convinced. The figurine gave me an uneasy feeling, but I didn't want to make a big deal of it. We set it aside and tried to focus on the festivities. That night, the real terror began. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, like boots on hardwood. I glanced at the clock. 2:14 a.m. beside me. Rachel stirred. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, slipping out of bed. The footsteps grew louder, moving up the stairs toward the kids' room. My heart pounded as I grabbed the fire poker from beside the hearth and crept into the hallway. The door to Oliver and Hannah's room was ajar. I pushed it open, expecting to find, I don't know, an intruder, a burglar. But there was no one. The kids were sound asleep, their blankets rising and falling with each breath. And then I saw it. The wooden figurine, the one Oliver had opened that morning, was now sitting on his nightstand. Only it wasn't the same. Its carved face had changed, the mouth twisted into a sinister grin. I backed out of the room, my breath quickening. "Mark?" Rachel's voice was shaky behind me. "What's going on?" Before I could answer, the bedroom door slammed shut behind her. The lights flickered, and a deep, guttural growl filled the house. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The kids woke up screaming, and we rushed to their room, but the door wouldn't budge. "Hannah! Oliver!" I shouted, throwing my shoulder against the door. It finally gave way, and we stumbled inside to find the room empty. "Where are they?" Rachel cried, her voice breaking. I spun around, my eyes darting to the window. It was wide open, snow blowing in, and there, just at the edge of the woods, I saw them. Two small figures being led away by a towering shadow, its horns silhouetted against the moonlight. "No!" I roared, charging out into the snow barefoot. The icy wind tore at me as I followed the tracks into the forest, Rachel close behind. The woods were a maze, the trees towering above us like skeletal sentinels. The tracks seemed to vanish and reappear at random, leading us deeper and deeper into the darkness. Then we saw it. A clearing lit by an eerie, unnatural glow. In the center stood the creature, its hulking form hunched over a sack writhing with movement. "Knecht Ruprecht," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't care what it was called. I ran toward it, swinging the fire poker with all my might. The creature turned, its face a grotesque mask of shadow and bone, and battered me aside like I was nothing. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me. Rachel knelt beside me, her hands shaking as she fumbled with something around her neck. It was a small crucifix, a gift from her grandmother. She held it up, her voice shaking as she began to pray. The creature recoiled, letting out a deafening roar. Its sack fell to the ground, and the kids tumbled out, crying but unharmed. I grabbed them, pulling them close as Rachel continued to pray. With one final, ear-splitting shriek, the creature dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind. We didn't stay another night. By morning, we were packed and driving out of Grimsberg as fast as the icy roads would allow. Herr Dürer tried to ask what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. Even now, back in Florida, the memory haunts me. The kids don't talk about it, and Rachel refuses to wear the crucifix again, saying it reminds her too much of that night. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the lights are low, I swear I can still hear the growl. The Shadow of Krampusnacht. It started as a dream trip. My wife, Melissa, and I had always wanted to experience a true European Christmas, and this year we made it happen. Along with our 2 kids, Jake and Olivia, we packed our bags and flew to Bavaria, Germany. The plan was to stay in a small village near the Alps, the kind of place where Christmas traditions felt untouched by time. We rented a cozy stone cottage on the outskirts of town, complete with wooden beams, a roaring fireplace, and views of the snow-covered forest. Everything felt magical. The cobblestone streets, the scent of roasted nuts in the air, and the festive markets. It was like stepping into a storybook. But the villagers were different. Polite, yes, but reserved. When we tried chatting with the bakery owner about local Christmas traditions, she hesitated before mumbling something about Krampusnacht and making the sign of the cross. Melissa laughed as we walked back to the cottage. Krampusnacht. What, like that Christmas demon thing? Sounds like a creepy old fairy tale. Jake, who was 14 and already in the full swing of teenage skepticism, rolled his eyes. Probably just a way to scare kids into behaving. Olivia, on the other hand, gripped my hand tightly. At 10 years old, she was still at the age where such stories felt all too real. "I don't like it," she whispered. I squeezed her hand. "Don't worry, Liv. It's just a story." But by the end of the trip, I'd come to realize it was much more than that. The first few days passed peacefully. We explored the village, bought ornaments at the market, and sipped glüh wine under strings of twinkling lights. The kids loved sledding on the nearby hills, and we had snowball fights that left us breathless with laughter. On the 4th night, everything changed. We had just finished dinner and were sitting by the fire, playing cards, when Olivia spoke up. "Dad, I hear something outside." Melissa frowned. "Probably just the wind, sweetheart." But when I paused and listened, I heard it too. A faint jingling sound, like sleigh bells carried on the wind. Jake smirked. "Santa's here early." Melissa shot him a look, but Olivia was already climbing into my lap, her face pale. "It doesn't sound happy," she whispered. I tried to brush it off, but the sound lingered in my mind long after we sent the kids to bed. At some point in the night, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but then I realized it was coming from inside the house. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hallway. I nudged Melissa awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She groggily sat up, her eyes widening as the sound grew louder. It was heading toward the kids' room. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and flung open their door. The room was empty except for Jake and Olivia, both fast asleep. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the snow outside the window, just beneath the faint glow of the moon, were hoof prints. The next morning, I told Melissa what I'd seen. She tried to laugh it off, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Maybe it was just a deer," she said, but her voice wavered. We decided to distract the kids with a trip to the local Christmas market. The festive atmosphere seemed to lift everyone's spirits, and for a while, I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined it. But as we were leaving the market, Olivia tugged on my sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, pointing toward the forest. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, just at the edge of the trees, I saw it. A dark figure, towering and still, its outline barely visible in the fading light. I blinked, and it was gone. That night, the bells returned. They were louder this time, echoing through the house like a warning. Melissa and I stayed up, huddled by the fire, while the kids slept upstairs. Around midnight, there was a loud thud from the roof, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. "What the hell is that?" Melissa whispered, clutching my arm. I grabbed the fire poker and cautiously opened the front door, stepping out into the freezing night. The roof was empty, but the hoofprints were back, this time leading away from the house toward the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I told one of the villagers about what had been happening. Her face went pale, and she muttered something in German before hurrying away. That evening, a group of villagers came to our door, led by a man who introduced himself as Klaus. "We need to perform a ritual," he said, his expression grim, "to protect your family." They brought sprigs of holly and hung them above the doorways, sprinkling salt across the thresholds while chanting in low voices. "Stay inside tonight," Klaus warned. "Do not open the door no matter what you hear." The night was eerily quiet at first. The fire crackled softly, and the kids were tucked into bed, though neither of them seemed able to sleep. Around midnight, the bells began again. They were deafening this time, accompanied by guttural growls that seemed to come from all directions. The house shook as something pounded on the walls, and the air grew icy cold. Melissa clung to me, her face pale. "What do we do?" "We stay inside," I said, my voice shaking. The pounding grew louder, and then the front door rattled as if someone or something was trying to force it open. Olivia screamed from upstairs, and I ran to her room, finding her curled up on the bed, staring at the window. "It's out there!" she cried. Through the frosted glass, I saw it again. The towering figure, its glowing red eyes fixed on the house. The villagers arrived just as the door splintered open. They carried torches and chanted loudly, their voices echoing through the night. The creature hesitated in the doorway, its twisted horns scraping the frame, before letting out an ear-splitting roar and retreating into the forest. Klaus stepped inside, his face grim. "You cannot stay here," he said. "The Krampus does not give up so easily." We left the village the next morning, heading back to the States with a story none of us would ever forget. Even now, weeks later, I sometimes hear the faint jingle of bells at night. And every time, I wonder if the Krampus is still out there, waiting for the next family to punish. Thank you for listening. Bloody subscribe. And I wish you a scary Christmas. Good night.